I want to start out with a problem that most of us don't think about very much. Even though there are lots of developmental psychologists in this room, and we all care about children and how children learn, a question that we haven't asked as much is, why do we have children at all? Not the obvious answer. I often give talks down in Silicon Valley to people like Google where it's not so obvious that they've figured that out, but probably in that audience, this audience, most of you have figured that out. But why is it that we have this very long period of immaturity and dependence? And that's a really striking question about human beings, because we have a much longer childhood than any other species. So if you look at this 7-year-old chimpanzee in the Gombe, by the time chimps are 7, they're actually producing as much food as they're consuming. And even in hunter-gatherer cultures, human children aren't doing that until they're at least 15. And my son just turned 30 last week, and even 30-year-olds were still writing tuition checks. So that's actually very puzzling, and we know that that happened in a relatively brief time. So we know that it happened in the actual period of human evolution. So again, if you compare us to our closest relatives, you can even track in the fossil record this drastically increased period of immaturity and dependence. And that period of immaturity and dependence comes with a lot of costs. So we need to have much more and broader investment in those young children during that period. So it seems like a kind of evolutionary paradox. Why do we have this exceptionally long period of childhood? And it turns out that if you look at across the animal kingdom, there's a really striking relationship between how long a period of immaturity, how long of childhood a species has, and roughly speaking, how smart the species is, how large a brain it has in particular, how flexible it is, and how much it depends on learning. And the sort of poster animals for this relationship are among the birds. In fact, the first place that this relationship was noticed was if you look among different bird species, for example, crows and corvids and ravens are incredibly intelligent animals, as intelligent as chimps in many ways. And this is a New Caledonian crow, and these New Caledonian crows actually use tools, for example, in ways that chimpanzees don't. In contrast, if you look at our friend the domestic chicken and various chicken relatives, chickens are basically as dumb as stumps. So they're very good at pecking for grain, they're not much good at doing anything else. And that's true about the chicken relatives as well. And when you look at the babies, chicks are reaching maturity in about 2 weeks. And there's studies that show that literally from the time they're born, they can already do pretty much everything that an adult chicken can. And that's a striking contrast to the crows, who are fledglings for as long as 2 years for these New Caledonian crows, which is a very long time in the life of the bird. And you can see this is a chart that looks at all sorts of different kinds of primates, and you can see this very clear relationship between how much flexibility there is, how intelligent they are, and how long a period of immaturity, how long a learning time. And we're, of course, off at the end of this distribution. So it's a puzzle. Why is it that we see this relationship? And if you look at if you actually look at what the crows are doing in this 2 years, you can get an interesting clue. So it turns out in the wild, one of the things that the crows use this great intelligence for is that they make these amazing tools. So they'll do something like take a pandanus palm leaf, strip off the leaves from the bottom of the leaf, nibble the end to a sharp point, find a hole that has termites in it, take this leaf, stir up the termites, and then pull out the leaf and have a sort of termite shish kebab. The termites actually stick to the little bars on the leaf. It's an amazing thing to do. In some ways, even more amazing is the fact that they have to learn how to do it in those 2 years. So in those 2 years, essentially what the crows are doing is screwing this up. So they're putting it in with the barbs on the wrong side, or they're putting it in with the thick end, or they're putting it into a hole that doesn't actually have termites in it. And the adult crows sort of sit there and tap their feet and give the babies the sticks to play with. During this long period where the babies are actually mastering this particularly complex skill. So it seems that that period of learning and indeed playing with the instruments that you need to use is what enables the adults to be so smart. Now, if you think about this from the context of, and as I said, we human beings have by far the largest relative brain size, the most flexibility, the greatest capacity to adapt to new environments. So this longer immaturity seems to come with a greater reliance on learning. And you can see interesting parallels to this process if you look at brain development. So what you characteristically see in brain development is this early period when there's a great many new neural connections being formed. And then there's a kind of tipping point where the connections that have been used a lot are strengthened or myelinated. There's more long-distance connections. And a lot of these local connections that aren't used are pruned. So you start out with a brain that's very, very well designed for learning. You can sort of see the difference between birth and 7 years of age. And then you end up with a brain that's very well designed for acting effectively, but not as good at being plastic or flexible or changing in the light of new experience. And another element of this development, particularly in human beings, is that a particularly late developing part of the human brain is this part called the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the executive office of the brain. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for things like long-term planning, focused attention, inhibition, and so on. And that's the latest part of the brain to develop in human beings. Again, this suggests that in the course of brain development, you can see this contrast between an early period where there's lots of flexibility and then a later period where there's much more control. And what I've suggested is that a good way of understanding this is to take some ideas from computer science. So computer scientists and neuroscientists talk about a very basic fundamental trade-off in trying to solve problems. It's a trade-off they describe as a contrast between exploration and exploitation. But here's a way of thinking about it. Suppose you're trying to solve a problem, and at this moment you're in a particular place. You have a particular set of ideas, a particular set of hypotheses, for example. Think about a big box of solutions, of possible solutions that you can get to. Some of them are going to be quite close to the solution you already have or the hypothesis that you already have. So one thing you can do is you can make little small adjustments to what you already believe or know or think of as a strategy, and then see if they do better than you would do otherwise. And that has the advantage that you're likely to get to a good enough solution fairly quickly. It has the disadvantage that there might be a much better solution that's much further away, much more different from the one that you currently have. And if all you do is make these little local adjustments, you're likely to get stuck in a local optimum, as the computer scientists call it. You're likely not to ever get to that far off place. Another strategy you can use is you can bounce around the space. So you can try something that's really, really different from what you're doing right now. And then you could try something else that's really, really different from that. And then you could go to another part of the space that's even further away. And of course, the disadvantage of that is that you're going to spend a lot of time on alternatives that actually aren't even relevant to the problem that you're trying to solve. But the advantage is that there might be a better way of solving the problem. In particular, there might be some of these higher order principles that you could invoke that would help you solve the problem. And if you do this kind of bouncing around, you can get to that initially unlikely solution. So the way that people in computer science talk about this is the first strategy is a kind of low temperature search. Sort of think of it as if that box was full of air molecules instead of being full of solutions or hypotheses. You're just staying in one place. And the second strategy is what's called a high temperature search. Again, you're sort of bouncing around the space and moving from one place to another very easily. Now, everyone in this room who will know about 4-year-olds, you can immediately say, which of those sounds more like your 4-year-old? Is it the one that's sitting there and carefully just doing small adjustments, or is it the one that's bouncing wildly around from place to place, both physically and psychologically? Well, it turns out that in computer science, the best solution, so the problem is that there isn't any best way of solving this problem. The more efficient you are, the less exploratory you're going to be, the more likely you are to miss the right option. The more exploratory you are, the likely you are to spend time on these options that aren't going to work very well. And the way that people in computer science solve this is through a process that's called simulated annealing. And essentially what happens in simulated annealing is that you start out with this very high temperature surge, and then you slowly cool off to the low temperature surge. So you can see, even if you look at this, this is an example of a very simple simulated annealing problem. Right now, let's say you're here, you want to find the highest spot on that graph, but if you just search very locally, you're not likely to actually discover that there's actually a better solution that's further away. And the typical kind of way of solving this is to start out really moving really far away in the search, and then eventually but you don't want to keep bouncing around, right? Because when you find a solution, you want to settle on the solution, and then you gradually cool off until you settle on the right solution. And my slogan is that childhood is basically evolution's way of doing simulated annealing. So we have this early period where we can do these kind of wild, crazy searches. And the reason, of course, why we can do that is because we have all of this investment in the human case, from not just biological mothers, but biological fathers, who aren't involved in caregiving for most mammals, and my personal favorite, grandmothers, who only exist among human beings. And in general, a much broader investment from adults, and it's that broad investment from adults that enables you to have this period of exploration, this period of high temperature exploration and learning. And I like this idea partly because it also kind of makes sense of a lot of things that look irrational or crazy or weird in what young children are doing. So if you even go back to people like Piaget, the great developmental psychologist, a lot of the things that he thought were signs of irrationality, noisiness, randomness in young children actually makes sense if you think that what they're doing is doing this kind of a high temperature. And there's two things that may be contributing to this. One thing is that just knowing less about the world kind of automatically makes you search more broadly for solutions. So if you don't know as much, then you're going to pay more attention to new data than if you do. That's one of the things that comes out of this Bayesian perspective. But the other thing is that there may just be something intrinsically more exploratory about children compared to adults. So if you're thinking about this exploration and exploitation trade-off, you think that there's something distinctive about childhood that's designed for exploration. One of the things that, of course, we know is that if you look, again, across the animal kingdom, what you see is this relationship between play and childhood. So it's striking that we, because this is so obvious to us as humans, we just take it for granted, but it's really a striking generalization. There's no reason why you couldn't have young chimps, be effective and go out and do things and have the older chimps play. But across all these different kinds of animals, what you see is that the period of play, you see much more play in the early period, and then play gradually tails off as animals get to be older. And of course, we know that the kinds of play that animals are doing reflect the kinds of solutions that they're trying to work out as adults. So, if you're talking about baby rats, for instance, they'll play at things like fighting and grooming and mating and the things that they're going to do as adults. Now, for human beings, we have a much wider repertoire of actions, a much wider range of things that we can do. And the kind of learning the kind of play that we do reflects that. So one kind of play that children do is this kind of external exploration, where they're actually going out and literally exploring as they play. And there's quite a bit of work now, although really relatively recently, in the past 10 years or so, work by people like my ex-postdoc, Liz Bonowitz, has done beautiful work on this, my ex-student, Laura Schultz. This is being a grandmother, as you get to boast about your children and grandchildren. Who's also done beautiful work on this. So that now there's starting to be quite a lot of really elegant work showing that this kind of exploratory play actually helps to solve some of the problems that children are trying to solve. And one of the particularly important problems for human children is figuring out the causal structure of the world. So, one of the ideas, this idea of the theory that a bunch of us formulated now in the 80s, a long time ago, what is it when you say, what do you mean when you say that children are going out and developing intuitive theories about the world? Well, one important element of intuitive theories is understanding cause and effect relationships. So one thing we know that children are doing early on in their lives is figuring out what the relationships are between cause and effect, what the causal structure of the world is. And for the last 15 years or so, my colleagues and I have been trying to figure out how is it that children are doing it? How are they solving that kind of scientific problem? And this kind of exploratory play seems to be really contributing to solving that problem. Going out and actually messing around with things is a good way of figuring out how cause and effect works, like scientists doing experiments. But there's also a kind of internal exploration. Think of this as being like scientists considering various kinds of hypotheses, or scientists doing thought experiments. Think about Einstein saying, what would happen if you imagine that the speed of light was at a constant as opposed to being variable? What kinds of consequences would that have? And that kind of internal exploration is something that's been studied much less than the kind of external exploration. And what I'm going to argue is that pretend play in particular is really a very good example of that kind of internal exploration of the space of possibilities. And I'm going to give you some examples from causal learning where you can show that children in the course of their pretend play are considering alternative ways that causes and effects could be related. Yeah. Now, in particular, one of the things that's really distinctive about causal reasoning is that it has a very close relationship to counterfactual thinking. And in fact, philosophers have argued that it's this relationship that really makes a relationship causal. So, for instance, if you think about, say, the relationship between smoking and getting lung cancer, and between smoking and getting lung cancer, and having yellow fingers and getting lung cancer. So having yellow fingers is going to be correlated with getting lung cancer. So people with yellow fingers are more likely to get lung cancer. But you wouldn't say that having yellow fingers causes lung cancer. Well, what's the difference? Given that those things are correlated, in both cases, smoking is correlated with cancer and yellow fingers are correlated, how can you cash out, and you can predict that if someone has yellow fingers, they'll get cancer, if someone smokes, they'll get cancer. What is it that makes one of those relationships causal and the other one not? And a good way of packing that out is to say, well, look, if you hadn't smoked, then you wouldn't have gotten lung cancer. Whereas if you hadn't had yellow fingers, if you washed your fingers, that wouldn't have made any difference to whether you got lung cancer or not. And similarly, if you did go in and change the smoking rate, it would change the lung cancer rate. If you went in and washed everybody's fingers, it wouldn't change the lung cancer rate. So the very idea of cause, just built into the very idea, is this idea of counterfactuals. And counterfactuals mean being able to think about ways the world could be that are different from the way the world actually is now. There's some debate in the literature about exactly what counts as being a counterfactual, most of which I think is not terribly helpful. But for my purposes, what I'm going to do is just say, it's being able to say, if the world were different from the way it is now, what would happen? What would be the outcome? And that kind of thinking, that ability to say, suppose the world is different from the way that I think it is now, is absolutely crucial for doing the kinds of causal inference and theory formation that we see all the time in young children. So counterfactual thinking is this really central idea. And if you think about it, of course, that's exactly what we do when we pretend. Is we set up different kinds of possibilities in the world and we figure out what the consequences are. So intuitively, it looks as if there might be a link between this kind of very useful, important, significant counterfactual thinking that seems to play such a deep role in our causal reasoning and pretending. But it's actually been hard to demonstrate that those two things are related to one another. And that gets back to some of the points that, that you were mentioning before. It's very hard to actually investigate pretend play in a lab because sort of almost by definition, if you give someone a job to do or a task to fulfill, that's work and not play. So it's hard to see how do you get kids to spontaneously do pretend play in a lab where they're working. And similarly, I think it's been hard to show, say, the benefits of pretend play. Because if you have a particular outcome that you're trying to measure, it's always going to be better to actually teach someone specifically what the outcome is going to be. That's always going to be more effective than simply letting them play until they discover the outcome. So the kinds of benefits that play in general has, and pretend play in particular have, are almost by definition hard to measure. So what we did was and we here is, you could ask questions like, is there in fact this relationship between the kinds of causal relationships that children are learning or understanding and what they're doing in their pretend play? And do these real world causal relationships carry over to preteens? But again, the puzzle was how could you actually test this? And here I have to say this is another grandmotherly example. Daphne Buxbaum, who was my graduate student who is now at Toronto, thought up an incredibly clever idea to actually put these two things together, counterfactual thinking and pretend thinking. And I'm going to talk about some experiments using her idea. So one of the ways that we've been investigating causal learning over these last 15 years, you might ask, well, how can you ask very young children things like, do you think this pattern of conditional dependency leads to a causal structure? The kids are not going to look very smart if you ask them that sort of question. So what we did was to invent these machines, the machine we call the Flipping Detector, and this is a machine, a box that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it and not other things. And it turns out that with this very simple device, you can show that even very young children are doing very sophisticated kinds of causal learning and inference. So you can show them a pattern of data on the machine, and then you just say to them, okay, make the machine go. And we've shown over 15 years, using this kind of apparatus, that even 24-month-olds can do things like use patterns of probability to figure out how the machine works. But for this experiment, we did something a little different. Again, we here being Daphne. We set up we set it up so that now here's, instead of just being a flipping detector, this is the birthday machine, and this is Monkey, and it's Monkey's birthday, and Monkey really, really likes to hear happy birthday. So this machine is a special machine we can use that will play happy birthday for Monkey because it's his birthday. The children get very excited about this. Then Monkey goes underneath the table, and you're introduced to the birthday machine and two objects. And it turns out that it plays happy birthday when you put a Xando on top of it, but not when you put something that isn't a Xando on top. So only Xandos. It's really a Xando machine. Only Xandos will make the machine play music. And what we do is introduce the kids to this very basic idea, see if they can figure out the causal relationship between the Xandos and the effect, and then we ask them a bunch of counterfactual questions. So if this one was not a Xando, what would happen if you put it on the machine? So now we point to the one that isn't a Xando, the opposite. What would happen? And if this one, which is in fact not a Xando, was a Xando, what would happen if you put it on the machine? So we're doing a kind of classic counterfactual. Here's the reality. This one's a Xando and this one's not. But now what would happen if it were different? And then we wanted to see whether the children would get that, answer those questions correct. Now here's where I think Daphne's brilliance came in. Now what happens is someone knocks on the door, there's a knock on the door, a mean assistant comes in and says, I'm sorry, I need the machine. And Daphne says, but we haven't played Happy Birthday for Monkey yet. She says, well, I'm sorry, I need the machine, I'm going to have to take the machine away. So she takes the machine away. And poor Daphne's terribly crestfallen, as are the kids. And she says, what are we going to do? We can't play Happy Birthday for Monkey. And then she has a bright idea. So the Confederate needs to borrow the machine. And the bright idea is, oh, I have an idea. We'll just pretend. Here's this box. Let's pretend this box is the birthday machine. And here's 2 blocks, and we'll pretend that one of these is a Zando and the other one isn't a Zando. And then we'll pretend Happy Birthday for Monkey. And the kids, slightly surprisingly, think this is a great idea, right? This is a good solution to the problem. And then the question is, all right, well, what should we pretend if we're going to make the machine go? So now I want you to pretend this. So what should we pretend? What should we pretend this block is, and what should we pretend the other block is? And then we reverse the roles. So the experimenter says, okay, let's pretend this block is a Zando, and this block is not a Zando. And now we'll pretend that this is the machine. We'll put them on the machine. And then then she reverses the roles. So she says, okay, now let's pretend the opposite thing. Now let's pretend this one's not a Zando, and this one is a Zando. And we pretend to put them on the machine, and then the question is, what are we pretending now? Are we pretending that the machine is making music, or are we pretending that the machine is not making music? My personal favorite of these is when you are pretending that the block is not a Zando, right? And what that means is that when you pretend it's not a Zando, you're pretending that it's not making music, even though actually it's not making music, correct? So I always think of this as being kind of like, in Shakespeare's As You Like It, where, it's pretending, Rosalind is a girl who's pretending to be a boy who's pretending to be a girl, who Orlando is pretending to be a girl as well. So it's pretty complicated. Here's what it looks like.
What do you think would happen if this one was a Zando when you put it on the machine? It would play music. Okay, and what do you think would happen if this one wasn't a Zando?
So this is the counterfactual phase.
No music. Should we try it?
And here's the pretend phase.
All right, I'm gonna bring Monkey back, okay? Okay, so for pretending that this is my machine, and this one is Zando, this one's not a Zando, what you can do to pretend music? Oh, do you want to try it? Oh, what's happening now? Music! Music! Happy birthday to you!
And interestingly, at the end of the pretend, Daphne said, can we pretend anything else? And something like 80% of the children elaborated on the pretend. So they had pretend birthday presents, and they had all these other kinds of pretends that were part of the pretense of Monkey's birthday. So it was pretty clear that they were actually really pretending. So how well did the children do on this task? These are 3- and 4-year-olds, and overall the children were better at chance at answering the counterfactual questions, but there were still quite a lot of kids who were not getting the answers right. And almost invariably what they did was, when they didn't get it right, was to give you the actual characteristics rather than the counterfactual ones. So they said, oh, okay, the Zando itself would make the machine go, and the non-Zando would not make the machine go. And we did this experiment twice. The second time, we got the same result. The Pretest Performance was actually very similar. So this is how what they chose to do when they were pretending. Again, very similar. And there was a strong relationship, a strong correlation between how well the children did on the pretend task and how well they did on the counterfactual task. So the children who were the literal children, who tended to say in the counterfactual case that it was just the actuality, were also the children who in the pretend case were not pretending, were just telling you what was actually happening. So these were children who were saying, there's never any music. There's, in fact, no music that's playing. These were kids who were accurately saying it. And interestingly, there was an age effect, so that the 4-year-olds were better at both the counterfactual task and the pretense task than the 3-year-olds. but we saw this correlation even when we controlled for age. And in the second experiment, in 1B, in addition to controlling for age, we also controlled for executive function and general cognitive development. So we gave the children an executive function task and a cognitive development task, and even when we controlled for children's performance on those things, we still saw this strong correlation between counterfactuals and pretense. So in summary, preschool children were both reasoning about counterfactuals in this novel causal relationship. In the pretend scenario, they were maintaining the causal relationship in a coherent way. But they could also flexibly reassign the role of the causal objects if they got both the initial case and the reversal case right. And there was a correlation between the causal counterfactuals and pretense. Now, an obvious question when you're thinking about pretend play is how might this vary across different cultures? And if you go to the ethnographic and anthropological literature, you get a slightly complicated story. It looks as if across cultures, there's some amount of pretend play. So it looks as if in every culture we know about, when children are little, they're doing some amount of pretend play. But there's also been a claim that there's much less pretend play in less industrialized cultures, for example. So or what's sometimes called our weird culture, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic cultures seem to have a little more pretend play than children growing up in other cultures. So we wanted to see, would we see this relationship if we looked in other cultures? So what we did was to do a cross-cultural replication of the study I just showed you in Peru. And in particular, we were looking at children who were sort of first-generation internal immigrants who come from the mountains and are now living in the outskirts and sort of the squatter suburbs around Lima, sort of the favelas. So these are very low-income children, urban children, who just come in from the countryside. So what we did was to have a bunch of children who were in school in Lima, and we just did the same experiment I just showed you about monkey spirits. And what we discovered was that the children were significantly worse in the counterfactual case than the children in Berkeley were. So they were producing fewer counterfactuals than the children in Berkeley. And they were, but interestingly, we saw something a bit different. So they were also doing less pretend than the children in Berkeley were, consistent with these claims in the literature about pretense. But two things were interesting. One of them was they were more likely to pretend than they were to make the counterfactual inferences. And there was less of a difference, even though there was a significant difference in pretense, there was less of a difference for pretense than there was for counterfactuals. So remember, the kids in Berkeley seem to have essentially the same level of performance on counterfactuals and on pretense. For the kids in Peru, they were actually doing better in pretense than they were on the counterfactuals. And interestingly, the relationship between the kids in Peru, the correlation, even though they were doing worse on both of them, was similar for the children in Peru and the children in Berkeley. So as in Berkeley, there was a strong correlation between the performance on pretense and performance on the counterfactuals. And again, just as in Berkeley, that correlation was preserved when we controlled for executive function and age and general cognitive. And in ongoing work, we're looking at children in Head Start programs. These are programs for very low-income children in Oakland, and looking at how they look. So these are low SES American children, and we're still in the midst of collecting the data, but it looks as if this data is quite similar to the kids in Peru. So what we're seeing is they do better when you phrase the questions in terms of pretense than they do when you just use a straight counterfactual. And you also see this correlation between how well they perform on the pretense and how well they perform on counterfactuals. And this is at least suggestive of the idea that the pretense may actually be scaffolding or allowing the children to do better on counterfactual questions. And that would fit with this general idea about pretense as this internal exploration of possibilities, an internal exploration of the counterfactual space. So the Peruvian children are better at pretense than at counterfactuals, and although they're providing fewer correct samples overall, and it looks as if the low SES children might be similar in the two cases. So we don't know what's behind these cross-cultural differences, but one possibility is that in fact, the fact that there seems to be less encouragement of pretend play for the Peruvian children, for instance, and if you go into the preschools that they're attending, there's very little pretend play compared to the amount that you see in, say, Berkeley preschool. It may be that that's having an effect on their ability to generate these hypotheticals. But of course, it may also be that there are broader differences in counterfactual and hypothetical reasoning, or there may be some other differences. So far I've been talking about relatively simple causal system, right? A Zendo makes the machine go, a not Zendo doesn't make the machine go. But could you also see some of these advantages if you're trying to infer more complex kinds of structures? So for this experiment, this is with Karen Walker as well as Daphne Buxbaum. We wanted to see whether the children whether pretending would help you to reason about alternatives in with a more complicated set of hypotheses. And again, this problem about search comes when you have fairly complicated hypotheses and you have to decide which ones to test. So for this, what we did was we took a machine that Laura Schultz and I had invented that we call the gear toy. And the gear toy is a box that has two gears on the top and has a switch on it. And again, very simple kind of system, but there's a lot of different possible ways that this machine could work. So it could be, for instance, that you flip the switch and it makes gear A move, which makes gear B move. Or it could be that you flip the switch and it makes B move, which makes A move. Or it could be that you flip the switch and the switch makes both of them move. Or it could be that you need to have B on the machine in order for the switch and A to work, and you need to have A on the machine in order for the switch and B to work. So what we did was we had a little training where we showed children these pictures and showed them each of these pictures represents one of these structures. So for example, this is the common cause where the switch is making both of the gears go independently. So what we did in this experiment was we showed the children the machine. We told them what the structure was. We say, okay, for this machine, the switch makes this one go and the switch makes the other one go. And then we gave them a bunch of questions, predictions to make about what would happen if we did various things to the machine. So for example, when I flip so suppose I take the green, this is the structure, I take the green gear off, and now I flip the switch, and the question is what will happen to the blue gear? Okay, will it spin or will it not spin if this is the way the machine works? Yeah, good, okay, good. You guys are as smart as 4-year-olds, yeah. So it will spin if this is the way the machine works. And in the work that we've done with Laura, we've shown that even 4-year-olds are surprising. I mean, I don't immediately have the intuition that I know what the answer to this is, but even 4-year-olds turn out to be surprisingly good at answering these questions. And then we could ask another question. When I flip the switch, will the green gear be spinning or not spinning? And if that's the structure, that's the right answer. So what we did in this case was we gave the children a pretend question. So what we did was we said, okay, so this is the way it actually works. It works with the switch making both of them go. But let's pretend that it works a different way. Let's pretend it works like this. Let's pretend the way it works is you make the switch go, and that makes the first gear move, and then that makes the second gear move. So let's just pretend this now. And now, what would I pretend if I just take this gear off and flip the switch? If I pretend that I'm going to take the gear off and flip the switch, you don't actually do it. What should we pretend about the other blue gear? Should we pretend it's spinning, or should we pretend it's not spinning? So in other words, we ask the question without the children actually seeing it. We just ask them to pretend this alternative causal structure, and then we see if in their pretend they'll work out what the right consequences will be. And we also asked the children the question not as a pretend question, but as a hypothetical question. So what if my toy, or counterfactual question, what if my toy worked like this? Then what would happen when I took one of the pieces off? And what we discovered, first of all, which was rather surprising, was that, again, the children were quite good at answering both these questions, the 4- and 5-year-olds. But there was an interesting difference. So first we did it as a between subjects experiment where the 2 questions were separate. And what we discovered when we did it between subjects was that children, again, were about as good at answering the pretend question as they were in answering the hypothetical question. But then we did it as a within subjects design where on the first trial, the children got, on the first trial, children either got the pretend case or the hypothetical case. And in this case, this is really hard. So what happens is, here's the actual structure. Then you say, what if it was a different structure, it was a causal chain, and then see what happens. And then you say, and let's pretend that it's yet another structure, it's a causal chain in the other direction. So you're actually having to override the initial structure twice. And for half the kids, they got the pretend first and then the hypothetical one, and for half the kids, the order was in the other direction. And here's what happened. When we looked at the hypothetical case, the children did much better if it was on the second trial. So in other words, if they had a chance to pretend first, then they did better when they had to have a hypothetical or a counterfactual, right? But we did not see that relationship the other way. So there wasn't a difference in performance for the pretense task on the first trial and the second trial. So again, this is a hint, as the cross-cultural work is, that it was actually that having the experience of pretending was improving the way that children were performing hypothetically, made them more able to release themselves from the requirements of the hypothetical case. Although actually improving their performance on the hypothetical case, or giving them information about counterfactuals, didn't seem to be changing the way that they were pretending. Okay, so to summarize, what we're suggesting is that this long period of protected immaturity that's so characteristic of human beings actually is designed for, that's what it's about, that's what it's there for, is designed to allow this period of increased exploratory learning through play. And we can see that in children's active exploration in this, when they're actually doing things to the toys. Oh, by the way, sorry, I should have said this. Fortunately, I don't seem to have the videos for this, but one of the things that we discovered in our original gear toy experiments since 2007 was that in those original experiments, if we just let the children play with the box, they figured out what the right causal structure was. So in the original experiments, what we did was we gave children data about, look, here's what happens when I do the switch and this one goes, and here's information about what happens if I do the switch and this other one goes, and they had to choose which was the right causal structure. And we discovered that children could do that when we gave them the data. And we also discovered that if we just let children mess around and play with the box, they got the information they needed to solve. So we've already got information that children can use exploratory play for this purpose. And it appears that exploratory play also allows for flexible learning mechanisms that help to support the inference of these different kinds of causal models. But the kind of exploratory play that does that is this kind of pretend play where you start out from a model and figure out what the consequences of the model might be. And maybe I'll talk in the discussion about some computational modeling that fits with that idea. So it seems that there might be this quite strong two-way interaction between the activity of pretend play and the kind of counterfactual reasoning that goes with pretend play, and the ability to build and use these causal models and counterfactuals and hypothetical thinking that seems to be such an important part of our reasoning and understanding. And as I say, I think we have a little evidence that pretense might be particularly important in scaffolding this kind of counterfactual and causal reasoning, but we think that it probably goes both ways, so that as we develop more complicated causal theories, that also allows you to pretend and hypothesize in more complicated ways. So let me end by thanking the people who, as usual, do all the work. Daphne Buxbaum, who's now at the University of Toronto, Karen Walker, who's now at UCSD, and Adrian Wenck, who did the cross-cultural work and is now working in a tech firm in San Francisco, and the various funders and foundations that have supported this work. And let me stop there and